Welcome back to the Dershow. If I seem a little tired, I just finished an hour and a half long speech with questions and answers at the University of California at Berkeley, the belly of the beast. Last time I was invited to Berkeley, I went in person, and there were efforts to try to prevent me from speaking or threatened a lawsuit. Finally, they allowed me to speak. There were protests, and I dealt with all the protests. This time it was by Zoom, and great questions. It was sponsored by the Federalist Society, which is a libertarian, right-leaning group. I'm myself a libertarian, but I'm not right-leaning. But it was interesting, and I was questioned by a moderator and then by a bunch of students. But it was a long, spoke for an hour and a half. But I'm energized. I'm ready to go, especially since my stock portfolio went up a little bit in the last couple of hours. I don't pay much attention to any of that because we're all in it for the long term. But obviously, we know that the government, any administration, has the ability to impact the stock market. If you have any doubts about that, look at what happened today. The president announced that there would be a 90-day moratorium on most of the tariffs, not the ones to China, and immediately the market went up over 2,000 points. I think the thing that really spooked the government was not the stock market; it was the bond market. Because usually stocks and bonds, I'm not an economist, but I'm not a financial person, act inversely. I mean, when the stock market goes down, usually the bond market is stable or goes up. In this case, we saw it happening at the same time, and it brought into question, the stability of the American financial situation. So I think there was a lot of nervousness. And whether or not President Trump had planned this from the beginning, I think what he planned from the beginning was flexibility, that nothing was permanent, that obviously these tariffs were designed to begin a negotiation. He's a negotiator, the art of the deal. I think I told you this before, but when he was writing the art of the deal, I was writing my book, The Best Defense, and we had the same editor. And when I would come and talk to my editor, Trump would have just laughed or would have sent a manuscript in. And I remember my editor telling me that here's the cover of the book, The Art of the Deal, but Trump wants more gold in the cover. And of course, he was right. His book became a major bestseller. Mine became a minor bestseller, but we had the same editor and worked on it at the same time. And of course, his presidency, in many respects, is the art of the deal. The art of the deal with China, the art of the deal with Iran, the art of the deal with Democrats. Democrats today did a disgusting thing. My friend Mike Huckabee, who's a great man, really wonderful man, great sense of humor. His wife is terrific and funny as hell. His daughter, of course, is the governor of Arkansas. Just a terrific guy, Mike Huckabee. And he was nominated to be United States ambassador to Israel. And it should have been a slam dunk. Every single Democrat, with the exception of Fetterman, every single Democrat, including Schumer, voted against this extraordinarily qualified man. He won. And I'm looking forward to having lunch or dinner with him in Jerusalem at the U.S. Embassy. I was there when the United States Embassy was moved. I sat in the front row, got a signed brick from the embassy, signed by Netanyahu. And so I'm looking forward to going back to Jerusalem and having dinner with our new ambassador, who's a good friend and somebody I have tremendous admiration for. But, people ask me, why did you leave the Democratic Party? Well, this is a good reason. This is a good reason. An extremely well-qualified person gets nominated not to pursue his own policies, but to pursue the policies of the United States government. And, if the Republicans had 2 or 3 fewer votes, he wouldn't have gotten through. And it's not just him. David Friedman, who was nominated previously in the first term, he got 2 Democrats voting for him. And Huckabee got only 1 Democrat. It's disgraceful. And shame on the Democrats for not being bipartisan, even on issues like Israel. Okay, let's turn to today's subject, which is an interesting one. A lot of headlines around the country about the Supreme Court siding with Donald Trump. Here's the one from the Wall Street Journal. Trump triple win at the Supreme Court. Triple win at the Supreme Court. Yeah, it's true. Technically, he won 3 cases, but they were all narrow and procedural. And I think both sides are making too much of these Supreme Court cases. The Supreme Court is sending an interesting message, I think. And it's, a 5-4 message. So, any one justice, Justice Barrett, obviously, who was appointed by Donald Trump, Donald Trump called me and asked me my advice on Supreme Court nominations when the vacancies occurred. People thought they could count on her vote always to be for Trump. And no, it turns out it isn't true. She, like other justices, are often unpredictable. And I think I understand what the court is doing. So let me set out my theory of what I think the Supreme Court is doing. And you say the Supreme Court. It's 9 people, and they're 5-4 or 6-3. So it's hard to describe the inner workings of an institution. But I think what the court is saying is to everybody, to all sides of this contested series of issues about deportation, about firing, about all that, they're basically saying to both sides, slow down, take a breath, think about it. We're not rushing anywhere here. We're not going to rush. You can deport people, sure. We're going to let you use the Alien Act of 1798 to deport people who you reasonably believe are against the interests of the United States and may have lied on their visa applications. We're going to let you do that substantively, but we're not going to let you violate their due process. We're going to make you comply with procedural safeguards so that, for example, you pick somebody up and you say he's a member of this horrible gang. Well, what if he's not? What if he was just had a tattoo that suggested he was a member of the gang? But it turns out he wasn't. So the Supreme Court is sending a message saying, you can do it, but do it carefully and do it slowly. And if you make a mistake, acknowledge your mistake. Now, the government did acknowledge its mistake. And it sent this guy to Salvador improperly. So now the question is, can you get him back? Of course you can get him back. President just today praised the president of Salvador. I think all he has to do is pick up the phone and call him and say, please do me a solid here. Just put this guy on an airplane and send him back. And, we'll give him due process. Then probably we'll send him back to you after we satisfy due process. He can do that. Now, the president of Salvador may say, no, you can't. We have a legal system, and our legal system requires due process. And so we have to go through due process before we can send him back. It's possible, but I do think that if the president really tried hard, he can get this guy back. The same thing with Khalil. Now, the argument is that Khalil supported Hamas and made statements supporting Hamas. Well, show it. Right now, the judge has said, I haven't seen the evidence. So, and Marco Rubio says, we have the evidence. So show the evidence. Maybe you have to show it in secret because maybe it comes from an undercover informer. I don't know. But show the evidence. Others have said, well, it doesn't matter what he did when he was in the United States, when he applied for his visa. He said, if he did, that he doesn't support Hamas and doesn't support violence. Now, if that's true, then he lied on his visa, or else he had a sudden change of mind. I don't think he had a sudden change of mind. So show the evidence, due process. And I think that's what the court is saying. You can do all these things, just do them right. So I think the headline is a little misleading. Trump's triple win at the Supreme Court. President Trump is exercising executive power in aggressive and often novel ways, and opponents are suing to stop him. But in a trio of recent orders, the Supreme Court has sent lower court judges an important reminder They must still respect judicial rules and procedures. A 5-4 majority handed Mr. Trump a partial victory, and it is a partial victory, by allowing the administration to continue deporting Venezuelans believed to be members of this gang under the Enemy Alien Act. But the unsigned order didn't really rule on the underlying issue. It just refused to slow down the process, and it said, basically, make sure you give them the process that's required. Make sure you give them due process. I think if you ask me to predict what the Supreme Court's going to do with the Trump administration, I think these cases indicate that that's the direction they're going to go. It's going to be a bifurcated direction. They're going to agree that the president and the executive authority have the power to do these things, firing people, cutting off funding to universities, deporting people. President Trump is pushing executive action to the limits unseen previously since the Roosevelt administration. So, and the court's going to uphold that. Maybe not always, but for the most part, there are going to be 5 votes, sometimes maybe 6 votes, to uphold the substantive power of the executive to bring about these results. They are within the authority of the president under Article 2 of the Constitution. But the 14th Amendment comes into play, and the 14th Amendment guarantees the due process of law to everybody, not only American citizens. If you're in the country and you're subject to action by the United States government, you're entitled to due process. And I think that's the line the court's gonna draw. It's not going to be an easy line to enforce because substance and procedure often merge. They come together. And what some people might think of as merely procedural can be substantive. If you make it too hard for the president to deport, you're really impacting the power to deport. So if the due process is too onerous, then we see a reduction in the power. But that's, these are old issues. These are issues that have divided Americans, certainly since the Civil War, when President Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. That's, you can say that's a procedural issue, but it means that if you arrest somebody for being active in the Confederacy and he says, no, I'm not, then there's no due process. So this is the direction I think the Supreme Court's going to go over the next months, years, who knows. Right now, most of these decisions are not on the merits. Most of these decisions are procedural, and some of them are issued just by one justice. Some of them are issued by all 9 justices, but almost none of them are issued after full briefing and argument, and most of them are preliminary. So if you're a Trump supporter and a Trump fan, don't take too literally Trump's triple win in the Supreme Court. On the other hand, if you're somebody who's opposed to Trump and think he's going too far, maybe you're right, and maybe the Supreme Court will sustain your view as well over time. We just don't know. This is a very interesting time. And it was Justice Felix Frankfurter. I was the Frankfurter professor of law, so I'm very familiar with his writing. It was Frankfurter who once said, the history of liberty is, in good part, the history of procedural safeguards, the history of due process, so that procedure impacts substance. If you want a country that really has substantive justice, you have to have a country that also has procedural justice. So I stick to the heading of today's show. SCOTUS rules in favor of Trump's power, but not necessarily on how he uses it. That's my legal analysis, and you're there to test me, and you're there to see whether or not my predictions come true. I've been called Dershowitz. I generally am pretty good at predicting, and the only one reason I'm good at predicting is I don't let ideology or partisanship interfere with my predictions. I base them always on my experience, my expertise, my knowledge of the law, my knowledge of the justices. So I never, ever let my preference for how I want a case to come out influence how I predict the case will come out. So you heard my prediction. Test me on it. As the cases come up, and they will come up week by week, we'll have a whole bunch of cases decided between now or mid-April and end of June. And some of them will reach the merits of these cases and test me to see if I'm right. Again, just to repeat, the Supreme Court will hold that the president has much of the power that he claims to have, even if it's more than other presidents have claimed, but that he will be allowed to exercise that power only consistently with the due process clause of the Constitution. That's my prediction. All right, let's turn to some letters. Got a lot of letters because I was very energized. Yesterday, I was so angry at the New Republic for printing this libelous, slanderous, horrible, wrong article about Trump saying the Nazis showed love to the Jews. It's ridiculous. First, a correction. I think Trump's comments about the Confederate statutes was a reference to Charlottesville, Virginia, not Columbia, South Carolina. You're 100% right. My wife's from Charleston, and I got confused, but it definitely was Charlottesville, Virginia. And that's the context in which he made that statement, and he didn't ever support the Nazis who said, you will not replace us. That was the beginning of the mendacious attacks on Trump, but they continue to this day. Here's one. We talked about Iran and nuclear weapons. Can't China just give Iran nuclear weapons next Tuesday? No, it's not that easy. North Korea tried to do that with Syria, and the Israelis caught them. And Prime Minister Olmert, a friend of mine, ordered an attack on the Syrian nuclear facilities and destroyed it. And Syria never built nuclear weapons, thankfully. Can you imagine if Assad had nuclear weapons? He would have used them on his own people, and he would have used them on the Israeli people. Much easier because it's so close. Syria is so close to Israel, much closer than Iran. So I don't think it's that easy. And I think if Israel had any inkling that there was nuclear weapons being smuggled into Iran from China, it would destroy those weapons. It wouldn't destroy them in China, obviously. It would destroy them as they came closer to Iran or were in Iran. Okay. There was a lot of talking about what the role of a college university should be and the role of a college teacher. Here's one. I don't feel like my job as a college instructor is to deliver information. Much of that can be obtained online. That was the point I made. And during COVID, I made videos of myself teaching, which I still use today. In class, I can explain the difficult topics and give students a chance to ask questions, and I'll have students do in-class writing. I do find it beneficial to see students face-to-face. My preference for a course is to teach in person once a week and do the rest online, but I've had some good experience with all in-person classes and even all online classes. So I really do think we're going to see a change in university teaching. I think what the most important change would be to establish a rule that no professor is entitled to express personal views in the classroom or under the auspices of the university, that you have to follow the University of Chicago rule, which basically says universities are forums for teaching, forums for expression of views, but universities don't have views, and university professors have to withhold their views while they're in the classroom. Okay, getting back to the New Republic, I got a series of questions that can be summarized in this one question. Can Trump sue that paper? Can you help him do it? I think the answer is yes, he could sue the paper. The paper, in order to sue, you have to show that it was a lie, and it was a lie. That's easy. That he was defamed. Clearly, he was defamed. Saying he basically said that the Nazis loved the Jews is defamation. But you also have to show that there was malice. And malice is not defined in the usual way that we think about malice, kind of nastiness and stuff like that. It's reckless disregard for the truth. And I think that the New Republic showed reckless disregard for the truth. And so, yes, I think he could sue. And if he asked me, I would certainly help him, because I think the New Republic was despicable and disgusting. by making that argument and giving that headline and editorializing throughout the article about what he really meant when there's no evidence that any of that is true. Love your energy today. I agree with you and watched it live. I was surprised and proud with the detail that he described the depraved conditions and treatment of those poor hostages. He rightly highlighted in excruciating detail how bad it was because the world needs to hear it from the U.S. president's mouth and understand the gravity of what the terrorists did, and to reaffirm we will not allow this and we will stand with the Jews. And I think making the point that nobody in Gaza has offered to help the hostages, even when they were offered money to do it, and contrasting that with the righteous Gentiles, Schindler's List, for example. Many of you have seen that movie, A Righteous Gentile, who helped save Jews, and Wallenberg, and there were so many others, some Germans. So it's clearly something that Trump was right about, and the New Republicans dead wrong. This is about Iran. It's a fool's errand to negotiate with a country that does not recognize your right to exist. Regime change, not breakable treaties, is the answer. I agree with you. I am 100% in favor of regime change in Iran, even if it takes military action to bring about regime change. There will never be peace in the Middle East as long as there is an Iranian regime headed by the mullahs, the revolutionary army, and the people who hate America. They think America is the big devil. Israel is the small devil. They support Hamas. They support Hezbollah. They support the Houthis. There's no way of reforming them. So I really do think regime change is the only answer, whether that comes about through the rights of the people to stand up within Iran and revolt, which we should help them do if they want to do that, or through military action. That's a much more complex question. Professor, as you aptly showed with your comments about the false story claiming Trump had said the Nazis gave the Jews the love, the news media is out of control. Would rolling back some of the protections granted to the press on the New York Times versus Sullivan and making it easier for public figures to sue the media when they have defamed stop some of the nonsense? Yes. I now think that the Supreme Court went too far, that it should not have required malice. It should have required something more than just falsity, and that issue should be left to the jury, not decided by the judge. I have a case now pending where I was defamed by CNN, where I said that Trump could do anything and could kill somebody, and he couldn't be impeached and wouldn't be impeached, when I said exactly the opposite. And a lower court judge ruled that I hadn't proved malice, and he took the case away from the jury, and we have an appeal now pending, which may go all the way up to the Supreme Court, in which we argue that malice should be an issue left to the jury. Let them decide, not some judge make that decision. Okay, this is interesting. Alan mentioned singing in Yiddish and Hebrew. I always thought that Yiddish and Hebrew were the same thing. If anyone reading this could succinctly explain the difference between Yiddish and Hebrew, I'd appreciate it. Well, I can. That's very easy. Hebrew is the language of the Bible. It's an elegant, beautiful language, and it has been restored in Israel. It's the first time in history that a language disappeared, like Latin disappeared, and has been restored. I mean, Latin is not the street language of Rome, but Hebrew is the street language of Israel, and that's purely Hebrew. Yiddish is a jargon, essentially. It was used by the Jews of Europe, mostly Eastern Europe, but Central Europe as well. And it was the language that they spoke to each other. It's a variation on Hebrew and a variation on German. It has words from almost every language where Jews lived. It was the street language that they spoke. And, there was Yiddish theater, and there was a whole Yiddish culture, and that was completely destroyed by the Holocaust. And that was one of the great tragedies. Great Yiddish literature. People have won the Nobel Prize for writing in Yiddish. All kinds of interesting things. Science was written in Yiddish. There was even Yiddish pornography, of course. There's pornography in every single language, and Jews that are different than anybody else. But Yiddish is a different language. The Sephardic Jews developed their own variation. It was called Ladino, which is Spanish, but with borrowing languages from a little bit of Hebrew, etc. So, these are variations, and many countries, many cultures have languages that are based on the common language, but then there are variations from it. So I'm glad. I used to sing both in Yiddish and in Hebrew. Many of you probably know the great song "Mein Yiddish Mama," "Mein Yiddish Mama." And this means my Yiddish, my Jewish mother, my Yiddish Mama. It was made famous, I think, by Sophie Tucker. And there are other famous Yiddish songs, and there are, of course, many famous Hebrew songs. The national anthem of Israel, obviously, is a Hebrew song called Od Balevav. And so there is a difference between Hebrew and English, although there's a similarity. Okay. As a student and then an employee of UC Berkeley, where I spoke today, the anti-Israel and anti-Semitism was notable, even for me as a non-Jewish tech-related student. I mentioned in 2001 to a buddy from Israel who subsequently legally gained U.S. citizenship, and he agreed. The synergy between leftists and anti-Jewish sentiment date back over a decade at least. Over a decade. Started with Voltaire back at 200 more years ago. It was not, and it was not the only way that so-called liberals there were ironic in their actions. But it is interesting that, traditionally, anti-Semitism was thought to be mostly from the extremist right, Nazis, etc. Well, they called themselves National Socialists. National Socialists, they weren't socialists, really. They were fascists. But now, throughout the world, anti-Semitism has become much more pronounced among people of the hard left. And they disguise it often as anti-Zionism, but it is just a code word. When the Soviet Union started to prosecute Jews in the 1930s, they didn't call them Jews, they called them Zionists. These people some of them never even heard of Israel. They had no interest in Israel. They weren't Zionists, they were just Jews, but, Zionists. When some racist black leaders in the 1970s and 80s were going after Jews, I remember they were calling them, the Zionists are selling us bad meat in Harlem. These weren't Zionists. These were butchers who, may or may not have been selling them bad meat. But the word Zionist has often been used simply as a cover for we don't like Jews. Okay. It's not just the students. It's the educators and the curriculum. I think you're 100% right. It is the educators and the curriculum. Final letter. If you want to learn something about the law, this is the man to listen to. If I could choose one person alive today to have dinner with, it would be Alan Dershowitz. Okay, you're on. If you can send me an email or send me a note, and if you're in New York sometime, I'll have dinner with you. And so make your wish come true. But I'm not giving out my email. I did that once, and boy, did I regret that. I got invitations to every terrible thing that you can imagine, and people use it to just attack me. So you're not getting my email, but if you can figure out how to get in touch with me, just write to me, tell me who you are. Your name is Tothra, Tothra, and if you really, really want to have dinner with me, all right, we'll have a little Chinese food or something, and we'll enjoy each other and see if we can learn from each other. All right, let's see what happens between now and next week. I'm not predicting anything about the market. I'm not predicting anything about Iran. I'm not predicting anything about Donald Trump. The one thing about Donald Trump, the one thing you can predict is he's unpredictable. See you next week.